That we're looking at tonight continues the beginning, or continues the application that was begun back in chapter 10. And each week I've tried to tie back to the original application that we saw in chapter 10, the things that we're looking at tonight. So let's take a peek back again for just a second at Hebrews chapter 10 and remind ourselves that what he's after, what the author is after in our own lives is, according to verse 22, that we draw near with a sincere heart in full assurance of faith. He's asking us to get close to God, to live by faith. And not only to draw near to God, but to stay near to God. Verse 23 says, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful." So he's calling us, on the basis of everything we've learned this year in the first 10 chapters of Hebrews, to draw near to God and then to stay near to God. Verse 35 of that 10th chapter reminds us that we ought not to throw, or tells us that we ought not to throw away our confidence, because our confidence has in itself a great reward. And so verse 36 reminds us that we have need of endurance. Endurance in our faith. Endurance in drawing near to God. All of chapter 11, probably the best known chapter in the book of Hebrews, gives us example after example of people who were known for their enduring faith, who paid the price necessary to draw near to God, who let go of the things that needed to be let go of in order to draw near to God, and then who endured in their stand before God. And they are referred to in our text tonight as witnesses. And it would be a mistake to consider them to be witnesses of our lives. We're not being told that they're overlooking us, looking over our shoulder and witnessing what we're doing. Rather, they are witnesses to the need for enduring faith. They stand on record, having lived their lives, as having proven that a person needs to endure in his faith and will be well rewarded if he does. So in chapter 12, verse 1, having read about all of these witnesses to the truth of the need for faith, and being surrounded or in the company of so many witnesses to the need for enduring faith, the writer says to us, speaking of living the life in Christ that we're called to, let us run with endurance the race that's set before us. And this is a text which has been for at least 10 years very interesting to me, because running with endurance is something for the last 10 years I've known something about. And I remembered this verse, I knew these verses before I started running with endurance on a daily basis, but I didn't really gain any extra insight into these verses until I began, for various reasons, to run with endurance on a daily basis. Now, I should let you know, so that you can relate to me, that for the first couple of years of my running experience, I absolutely detested everything about it except being able to say in a casual way in my office that I did it. But getting up in the morning and getting into my running clothes and running around my 2-mile route and coming back, I hated every aspect of it. And I can remember early in the morning, I was 23 years old, and running along and trying to think of how long I'd be working, because I'd agreed that I would run each morning before work. I didn't want to become a stuffy and pudgy office worker, so I was working out how many years I could expect to stay in my career, and so how many mornings that would be I'd have to get up, and how many miles more I had to do, and I was looking forward to retirement in the hopes that I wouldn't have to keep this up. I hated it. And then, just to explain how I got into this in a bigger way, I came across a fellow in the office I was working at, this is in a publishing house, who ran 5 miles every day while I was slugging along at 2 miles and hating every step. And he didn't hate it. He ran 5 miles most days and asked me if I had not yet experienced the euphoria of running long distances. And I said, "What's euphoria?" And he said, "Well, it's a wonderful and pleasurable experience that everyone experiences once he crosses his pleasure threshold." And euphoria sounded a whole lot better than the things I was experiencing day after day out there on the road. And so I went looking for my euphoria. He said he could experience euphoria at the 5-mile mark, and he used to run 5 miles and feel it and go home with a big grin on his face. So I went one day running an indefinite distance and came home. I was disappointed. I had not found my euphoria. I clocked it in my car. It turned out that I'd run 6.5 miles, no euphoria. So I went back to him with a complaint. I said, "It doesn't work. I didn't find a threshold in that distance." And he said, "Well, maybe your threshold's higher than mine is." So a couple days later, when I had recuperated from the 6.5-mile slog, I went out looking for my euphoria again, and I ran 12.5 miles. No euphoria. But that night, Debbie and I went to a party in a neighboring city. I can't remember what kind of party. We're there standing around talking about this and that, and I got a great mental euphoria out of explaining to people that this afternoon I'd gone out and just for the fun of it run 12.5 miles. So it did great things for my ego, terrible things for my shins and knees, and I kept looking. Well, I didn't find any euphoria, but I found a sort of psychological thrill at being able to say I do this ghastly thing on a regular basis. So I started running long distances, and I made the mistake, or I would say perhaps it was a mistake, of buying a couple of running magazines and a book on running, which really prepared me mentally for the whole ordeal of becoming a long-distance runner. And I got to the point where I could run 8 miles every day. I only lasted at that for 2 weeks, and on the 8th run, I did 4 8-mile runs one week and took the weekend off and went back at it again the next week. I thought, this is great. I'm the kind of guy who runs 8 miles a day. It was a lot of fun to talk about that at coffee break, too. Suddenly, something in one of my legs went ping, and when I got home, I couldn't walk. And it was 4 months before I could run again, and I found out that I had experienced not euphoria, but something almost as exotic, a stress fracture. That's a microscopically broken leg. You don't get a microscopic set of crutches or a microscopic cast, but you do have a mouthful of technical terms to talk about. It was 4 months before I could run again. But I really had begun to enjoy it over the process of building up to 8 miles or so. I mean, more than just being able to brag about what I was doing, I really found something sort of satisfying about running all that distance and perhaps getting in shape. It's arguable whether or not it does you more good or harm to do that sort of thing. But I noticed that I didn't really begin to enjoy it until I got intensely involved in it. And once I really gave myself to it, what had been sheer drudgery before suddenly became acceptable and even pleasurable. Well, one thing led to another, and eventually for a 4-year period of my life, I ran a marathon every year. It's a 26.2-mile road race once a year. And I spent 6 months building up to it and 6 months recovering from it, and for 4 years I did 1 marathon a year. And I learned some things about running in that which have great application to the life that God calls us to live, and which we're being called to live here under the use of this analogy, let us run with endurance. So I'd like to pass on to you, because it is in our text, blow by blow, the things I learned as a long-distance runner which apply to our lives as Christians. The first thing we're told here as we see the need to run the race is to lay aside every encumbrance. To lay aside every encumbrance. An encumbrance is anything which slows a person down. And it's very important for a person who's going to do any kind of running to recognize that certain things in his life, like ski jackets and army boots, slow a person down. As I learned about running, as I read those running magazines and my running book, and I came to learn some things about running which really made a difference. And one thing I realized as I read about it was that almost everyone wears too much clothing while he runs. Now, I ran all year long, so from about November to March, I thought I had some justification for bundling up in a vest and a ski jacket and a couple of toques and a couple of mitts and socks over the mitts. I dressed like I was going to explore the North Pole. But I found out that that was one of my main problems. And one of the reasons I was really hating running was that I was overheating. And so I found that even in the winter, you wear hardly any clothing. I mean, by any normal standards, you hardly wear any clothing. And in the summer, you wear as little clothing as is legally permissible. And that makes the whole thing more easier because you don't overheat. And if you don't overheat, you don't get that ghastly feeling that you're about to collapse. And eventually, you can really begin to enjoy running. The word of wisdom, and running is not a complicated sport, so the words of wisdom are very simple. The word of wisdom that comes to us here is that the first thing you need to do is to get into your running shorts, which means take off your jeans, take off your heavy clothing, take off your warm-up pants or your coveralls, and dress very, very lightly. Well, that has application to our lives as Christians. There is a need for us as Christians to run light, because some of the things that we bring into our lives for our own pleasure or protection or convenience are the very things that are slowing us down as we seek to run the race that's set before us. Remember in the parable of the sower, what choked out the third seed that fell into the thorny ground was the thorns that sprang up. The thorns sprang up and choked out the fruitfulness of that particular grain of wheat. And Jesus, in explaining the parable of the sower, said that in some cases, as the Word of God is sown in the heart of a person, it springs up and causes growth, but the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke it out. What that tells us is that when some people say that they find it very difficult to live a Christian life, they find that they're not cut out for it, that it's not as simple as it ought to be, and they've tried it and it doesn't work. What you see there is that they're encumbering themselves, weighing themselves down, trying to take into the race for their own pleasure or satisfaction or security, the very things that they ought to have let go of. Paul said to Timothy, Paul said to Timothy, it's been a while since I looked at this one, no soldier in active service entangles himself in the affairs of everyday life, so that he may please the one who enlisted him as a soldier. What is all right for a civilian to surround his life with is not all right for a soldier. And what it's all right for a civilian to wear, standing on the sidelines, cheering the runners on, is not all right for a runner. And so what's okay for your neighbors, I mean, what morally neutral issues in their lives are okay for them are not okay for us. It's a little like the point this morning. where Abraham recognized that Aner and Eshcol and Mamre were able to form allegiances with the king of Sodom for their own protection, but it would have been wrong for him. So in many ways, things that are morally neutral and have nothing evil about them still are wrong for us to hold on to and slow us down in the race. Abraham, according to chapter 11, had to leave behind everything about his former life in Mesopotamia. Moses had to leave behind the riches of Egypt and all the pleasures of sin, all the pleasures of being the daughter of Pharaoh's, or the son of Pharaoh's daughter, a prince in Egypt. In the same way, God calls us to let go of certain things, even morally neutral things, because they are the very things that are slowing us down. So let me ask you, as you think about your life, how easy you're finding it as a Christian. It's supposed to be easy in many ways. Jesus said, "My yoke is easy, my burden is light." John says his commandments are not burdensome. It's supposed to be sort of effortless for us to live the Christian life. We're not supposed to find it an insurmountable challenge. And if we are, the most likely explanation is that we're still trying to hold on to things which in fact are slowing us or weighing us down. So you've got to think about the relationships in your life. For Abraham this morning, his possibility of a relationship with the king of Sodom is the very thing that would have slowed him down in his pursuit of God. You've got to think about your material possessions and the hold they have on you and the weight that they weigh you down with. You've got to think about your pastimes and the things that take fair chunks of your time and energy, perhaps to no profit. You've got to think about dreams and ambitions which guide and steer you and direct you, perhaps away from where God wants you to be. And in every case, realize that the run will not get easy. The race will not be run well until you lay aside the encumbrances, until you take off the burdensome weights, the extra clothing, and begin to run light, to begin to run in in running clothes rather than in civilian outfits. There's a big difference between the people tromping down the middle of the road running the race and those who are standing looking on. The people standing looking on can wear parkas and umbrellas and overshoes and overcoats and all kinds of things, but it doesn't matter for them. They're not trying to do anything except watch. If we're trying to run with endurance, the race is set before us, we've got to take off all of these extras. I would challenge you to prayerfully consider. Ask God to show you what are the encumbrances in your life. You might be surprised that he reveals to you things that you never thought of were issues at all. And what I'm trying to say is they're not issues to anyone else, but they may be issues to you. And maybe that God is saying, you're never going to run well. You're never going to follow me closely until you let go of this thing, until you give up that thing, until you part with your affiliation with that thing. We've got to leave certain relationships, certain possessions behind if we ever wish to run the race well. Well, that's the first thing I learned, to run in running shorts instead of warm-up pants or overshoes or whatever makes the running a whole lot easier. The second thing that we're told in verse 1, having laid aside every encumbrance, is to lay aside the sin which so easily entangles us. Now again, I said that running is not a complicated thing, so the words of wisdom that come to us from the running experts strike us as being very, very simple. I think sometimes the same thing applies in our lives as Christians. It's not a complicated endeavor. The advice is very simple. Well, for a runner, having gotten into his running shorts, the next important thing for him to do is to tie up his shoelaces. You wouldn't think much of a person who trained, for example, for the Olympic marathon, 4 years of arduous slugging, day after day, running long, long distances, and then at the last minute forgot something as crucial but as fundamental as tying up his shoelaces. Running books make a great to-do about the importance of tying double knots in your shoelaces. There are some sports therapists who've gotten their PhDs on the subject. The importance of tying double knots in your shoelaces has a profound, and it's a profound truth for a runner. You look for things like this to give insight to the sport. But tripping up on your shoelaces when you're 500 yards from the finish line and have a good lead is foolishness. Well, a Christian who takes a lighthearted attitude towards disobedience of any sort, a Christian who is not serious about freeing himself from sin, is as foolish and as naive as a runner who forgets about the importance of tying double knots in his shoelaces. It's just that simple. Sin entangles as easily as untied shoelaces entangle a runner. We don't have to look very far for illustrations of this fact today. A man named Jim Baker has illustrated for us just how entangling sin can be. Whatever else goes through our mind as we look into that horrible mess that's being broadcast all over the world these days, the whole scandal of the sin that behind the scenes and so on, what we ought to see there is a very striking illustration of a couple of biblical truths. And one is the Old Testament truth that we can be sure that our sin will find us out. Another is that anyone is capable of falling. Sin easily entangles. Anyone who is casual about sin or for any reason rationalizes disobedience to God is bound to be entangled and eventually disqualified. We see it as clearly as the headlines of today's newspaper these days, and I don't need to say anything much more, except that Paul felt the same pressure to tie up the shoelaces, to be done with sin, to lay aside the sin which so easily entangles us. And he spoke about it, for example, to the Corinthians. He said, I buffet my body, I lead it about like a slave, I'm hard on myself, I'm severe towards sin, I'm not lighthearted about the possibilities of falling into sin, lest after I preach to others, I myself should be disqualified. He says, I realize that I too could easily be entangled with sin, and so I tie up my laces. Well, how are we to go about laying aside the sin which so easily entangles us? If you know that there's sin in your life, well, it's a very straightforward matter. You must confess your sin to God, which means you must agree with God that what he calls it is what it is. It's sin. It's disobedience to him. And we have the promise that he's faithful and righteous to forgive us from all our sin and to cleanse us from the unrighteousness that comes in through disobedience if we confess our sin. But if you're not presently in sin, and I hope that you're not, still there are certain things you need to do in order to tie up the laces, in order to rule out the possibility of stumbling or growing entangled in sin in the near future. How do you tie up your laces then? How do you ensure that you won't be entangled in sin? Well, first of all, there's a matter of taking on a certain attitude towards sin. I'm looking forward to the fall when we can go through the book of Romans methodically. And as we do, we'll come to chapter 6 and verses 11 to 13. And the one interesting thing about Romans 6, 11 to 13 is that they are the very first practical instructions given in the book. Paul goes 6.5 chapters before he gets applicable or practical, although you could argue that everything he says has some practical worth in our lives. But there he says, Romans 6:11, consider yourselves to be dead to sin. Consider yourselves to be alive to God. Therefore, do not let sin reign in your mortal body, that you should obey its lusts. And don't go on presenting the members of your body to sin as instruments of unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God. He's saying, understand that by the virtue of what Christ has done on the cross, you are done with sin. The official connection between you and disobedience has been severed. You have no business getting back into areas or actions of disobedience. So consider yourself dead to it. Recognize that the death certificate's been signed. You and sin are over. The relationship is severed. And don't go on presenting yourself to sin. Don't go on presenting the aspects of your life to sin. Rather, recognize that you're done with it. Take up an attitude of completion, an attitude of finality. Recognize that you and sin must have nothing to do with each other. Well, that's easy enough to do academically. Say, right, I'm a Christian, and sin is for non-Christians, so the relationship is over. But it gets very painful to do on a personal level when the sin you're talking about being finished with is emotionally close to you. I mean, if you're talking about a relationship which is wrong, then you're talking about parting company with a person that perhaps you care very much about. When you're talking about letting go of a habit which you've grown attached to, whatever that habit is, whether secret or public, again, you're talking about giving up something which is close to the heart. So it's no small thing to say, take on an attitude of finality, take on the attitude that you're finished with sin. Sometimes that can be a very painful spiritual exercise, but a very essential one if we are to lay aside the sin which so easily entangles us. And having taken on that attitude, then the second thing we can do to tie up our laces is to take up a strategy to avoid sin at all costs. In the Proverbs, the statement is made that we are to enter not into the path of the wicked and go not in the way of evil men. The proverb goes on, this is Proverbs 4:15, avoid it, pass not by it, turn from it, pass away from it. The writer in the Proverbs is going out of his way to say that if you wish to avoid sin, you've got to make every effort to plot a strategy by which you avoid the very appearance of evil, avoid the very possibility of being associated with it. Paul says the very same thing in the New Testament to the Thessalonians. He says, prove all things, hold fast to that which is good, abstain from even the appearance of evil. If it even looks evil, stay away from it. Be done with it. There's no place in a Christian's life for a proximity with evil. There's no place for a serious Christian who wishes to lay aside the sin which so easily entangles to say, well, I think it's under control. I think I can get this close and still handle it. I don't think this is likely to lead to sin. We must be much more severe about the possibility or the presence of sin in our lives than that. In Ephesians chapter 5, Paul says, don't let immorality or any impurity or greed even be named among you, as is proper among saints. He says later on in Ephesians chapter 5, It's disgraceful for us even to speak of the things which are done by them in secret. And we have to plot a strategy of distance from sin, which is so thoroughgoing that we don't even talk about it anymore. And that rules out the possibility of certain conversations which we may consider to be legitimate conversations because we're just talking about the way the world is, or what has happened over here, or the way things continue to exist. But in fact, while we converse about these things, we're breaking down our barriers, we're breaking down we're tearing down the distance between us and it, and growing emotionally closer to the possibilities of sin. We have to be very severe and make a strategy by which we keep a distance, a long 10-foot pole distance from even the possibility, even the mention of disobedience to God. Why? Because it so easily entangles us. Now, some of you don't have shoelaces, you wear loafers. But if you have shoelaces, the next time and every time you tie up your shoelaces from then on, realize that the very same sincerity with which you tie up your shoelaces, recognizing it's a dangerous thing to walk around with them untied. So in the same way, it's awfully important. It's entirely important for us to be severe about the possibilities of sin in our lives and intensely plot strategies to be done with it, to lay aside the sin which entangles us. Okay, so having laid aside the encumbrance and the sin, what do? Well, we run. He says, let us run. And so the point is, again, that having, very simple, the point is that having gotten into your running shorts and having tied up your shoelaces, you've got to start running. You've got to get out there and begin doing it. Most marathons you enter in, especially back in my day, I ran marathons from 1979 to 1982, and the fad was upon me, and I tried to make it clear that I wasn't being caught up in the fad. I just independently came to it, but it was probably a crock. When I entered these races, one every year for 4 years, I entered with 3,000 or 4,000 others, which meant the possibility of winning the race was so remote that we didn't even talk about it. And it's a very, very naive question to ask someone who runs marathons, so did you win? Because in all likelihood, 2,000 people crossed the finish line before he did. But in a race, certainly my case, in a race like that, with 3,000 or 4,000 people lined up on a two-lane street waiting for the starting gun to go off, never mind crossing the finish line, the first challenge is to cross the starting line. And it's very annoying if you're trying to run your very best and you've trained for months to take up to 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes to get across the starting line. But that's what happens. The gun goes off. There's the ceremonial roar of the runners. We all do that. We don't know why. We just go. There's a big roar of the crowd. And then you take one step forward and you bump into the guy in front of you. Well, the guys who were invited to the race, they line up at the starting line, and it takes them half a second to get across. But those of us who are seated well back, 3,000 and 4,000 behind the likely winners, take 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes to cross the line, and it's very annoying. You have your stopwatch going, and then you wait and you wait and you wait until you cross the starting line. You're actually in the race. I mean, you could go to sleep waiting. It's very annoying. There's some similarity between that and how some people live out their commitment to Christ. I mean, there are some people who are still waiting around behind the starting line, not having started running yet, not having begun to put into action all the things they know to do. 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes seems significant to a person who's trying to break a certain barrier. Years often fill in the same place in the lives of Christians who know they ought to get running, who know they ought to start putting into action the things that they've been told, but haven't yet got around to crossing the starting line and starting. So the instruction here, as we say, start running, is simply that you better start doing what you know to do. Running is a very simple thing. First you put your right foot forward and you put your weight on it, and then you change, put your left foot forward and you put your weight on it, and you start doing that quickly. Well, starting to run the Christian race, starting to live the Christian life is similarly very simple. You start by doing the things you know to do. You start by opening the Bible and methodically trying to hear God's voice through it, by asking God to speak to you through it, and then doing what he says to do. Not waiting for the complete package to be delivered to your door, not waiting for a complete system of theology to be developed, but simply putting into action day by day the simple things that God says for you to do. You can't expect God to tell you to do anything complicated when you haven't proven that you can follow simple instructions yet. And then begin to pray. We just got to start simply sitting down and saying, here I am, Lord, don't know much about what I'm doing, but I do want to be a person who prays, so help me. The disciples said that to the Lord. Teach us to pray, they said. And he gave them a very simple, straightforward prayer to pray. And then get your house in order. Go through the parts of your life, the parts of your family, and think about the things that need to be taken care of. And take care of those things. Make a start, is what I'm saying. The first step in winning the race is to start running. There are people who say, well, that's the hardest part. The hardest part is to just get going. And those people who say that give themselves away. People who say the hardest thing about the race is just getting going prove that they haven't started yet. Because it's not the hardest thing. In fact, it's the simplest thing to get going. What's hard is to keep going after that. And what we're being told after he says, let us run, is to keep going. We start running, and then we've got to keep going. And that's the hardest part. Let us run with endurance the race that's set before us. You know, in a 50-yard dash at a Sunday school picnic, you just get going and it's over anyway, so you might as well just start. But in a long-distance event, like a marathon of 26 miles, the hardest thing is to keep on going. The challenge is to keep going when you've worn out all your energy in the first half of the race. It's going to take all of your resources. It's going to take all of your good ideas. It's going to take all of your thinking and all of your energy to finish this race. It's an endurance race. And so we're being warned to run with endurance. Remember that this fits in with the theme that has been carried out from before chapter 11. Remember 10:36, you have need of endurance. Remember in chapter 11 how many people we were told endured in their faith? Well, we're being told the same thing here. It is an endurance race. It's going to take a lot of training. It's going to take a lot of effort to keep on going and to finish strong. To be able to say what Paul said at the end of his life, I have finished the course. I have run the race. Well, he was able to say it because he tried. He was striving all his life with all his energy to keep on going. And he managed to pull it off. If you're interested in keeping going, starting the race and keeping running, well, verse 2 gives us a couple instructions on what we can do about that. And I want you to see that when he goes to verse 2 and says, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, he's giving us a couple of practical ideas in that instruction on how we can keep on going. So you could say that point 5, which follows point 4, is really an elaboration of point 4. Here are a couple of things you can do to keep going. And if you have found it difficult to maintain your diligence and to maintain your disciplines, then I think these things will be perhaps a help to you. When he says fixing our eyes on Jesus, he's meaning at least a couple of things. One thing he means, I think, is to set goals. As we're running, it's awfully important to keep remembering why you're out there doing it. The big surprise to me in my very first marathon was to find that after about 14 or 15 miles, when I was completely exhausted and still had a long 10 miles to go, I lost every reason for being out there. It seemed to me the stupidest thing any human being could ever do to try to run 26 miles in public. And I wondered why I'd ever started. Well, it was important for me to set goals and to keep those goals in mind so that I could remember and keep reminding myself of what I was doing out there. The first race I did forget, and I walked a long way trying to remember what it was I was doing out there, which was very embarrassing to talk about afterwards. But when he says fixing our eyes on Jesus, he is saying keep your mind on the goal. Because Jesus and the attitudes, the Christ-likeness of Jesus, the character of Christ, is our goal. We're told again in Romans that God's intention in saving us and in drawing us to himself is that we be like him, that we be conformed to the image of his Son. That's God's goal for us. The long-term goal in this race of endurance is that we be conformed to the image of Christ. So we fix our eyes on Jesus because it's Christ-likeness that God is after in our lives. That's what he's got in mind for us. And as we run the race, and as we grow weary, and think, verse 3, of losing heart, we can be encouraged to recognize what we're in this race for, what it's all about. We're here, we're living this life and putting out this effort in order to someday become Christ-like. Now, the thing about goals is that you've got to break down a big goal into short-term attainable goals or it'll do you no good. A person who walks around saying, well, I just want to be Christ-like, that's my goal, Christ-likeness, is bound to be frustrated because every day he'll stand up and try to be completely Christ-like. And 5 minutes into the day, as he's crabby about the fact that he got cornflakes in his bowl instead of Rice Krispies or something, he blows it again and thinks, well, no sense in keeping it up this day. Tomorrow, I'll try to be Christ-like. You take a big goal like Christ-likeness and break it down into short-term attainable goals, or it'll do you no good. This is obviously true in running. It's true in every discipline of life. And the Christian life is, in this sense, a discipline. My goal as a runner was to get to Boston. Back in those days, Boston was the most prestigious marathon there was. And I thought it sure would be fun, egotistical again, over the coffee table or over the lunch table in the coffee room, and say, yeah, I was just down in Boston this week and, running the marathon. That race was 99 years old at the time I first took an interest in it. It was so old, it was very, very prestigious. And it was so popular that they set a qualifying time for it. Again, it was prestigious because it was the only race in North America that had a qualifying time to it. To run Boston, to cross the starting line at Boston, you had to run another marathon within no more than a year before in under 3 hours. So I wasn't stupid. I realized that if I wanted to get to Boston, I had to run a marathon in under 3 hours, and I wasn't so stupid to realize that before I could talk about running a 3-hour marathon, I better see if I could live to tell of the experience of running a marathon at all. So my long-term goal is running Boston, and my more short-term attainable goal is to run a marathon in under 3 hours within a year, and the more attainable goal than that was to finish a marathon. So I got my marathon books out, and one of them said, if you want to finish a marathon well, you've got to be able to run 10 miles and feel springy. So I thought, okay, there's a more short-term attainable goal. So I went out I who was running 8 miles every few days. And I ran 10 miles, and I thought I was going to die. I noticed that there was nothing springy about me at the end of 10 miles. So I thought, all right, well, okay, I've got to break this one down. Let's go for 5 miles and springy. So I ran 5 miles, and I stood there, and I went boing, 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 and I said, not bad, I'm springy. So I moved that up and said, okay, now I'll try to run 8 miles and feel springy. And I read some books and planned some strategies and learned how to run 10 miles feeling springy. And then I pushed my frontiers on, and bit by bit, day by day, I accomplished my goals and broke down the long-term goals into short-term attainable goals, and eventually I ran a marathon. And I'm here to say that I still have not accomplished my objective of running a 3-hour marathon, but 2 or 3 years into my attaining of short-term attainable goals, they dropped the qualifying time down to 2 hours and 50 minutes. And I saw where this was headed and realized that it was soon, unless I was willing to quit my job and leave my wife and do nothing but run all day long, every day, I would never reach my goal. And I gave that one up as something quite out of reach in terms of the time and energy and commitment I had for it. Well, what I learned from that, and it's done me very well in my spiritual experience, is that if I want to attain the goal of Christ-likeness, I better methodically and strategically break down that big goal into short-term attainable goals. If I'm to be Christ-like in every way, then I have to be Christ-like in my attitudes. So before I work on anything else, I say to myself, let me take on the attitudes of Christ. If I'm going to be Christ-like in all my attitudes, it means being Christ-like in each attitude. So why don't I pick one? Like the servanthood of Christ. His ability to serve people. You know, he stripped down into a slave's costume and washed his disciples' feet. So I take my big goal of Christ-likeness and I say, what I'm going to do in order to become Christ-like this year, this month, today, is really is work on developing an attitude of servanthood. Try to be a servant like Jesus was a servant, who came not to be ministered to, but to minister. Not to be served, but to serve others. And then I can go on. Jesus had a tremendous love for people, so I should work on a love for my neighbor that results like Jesus, like it did in Jesus' life, in specific actions. And then I can think about his purity, and so work on purity of thought. And I can think about how his relationships were all what God intended them to be. So I can work on my relationship to my wife and my children and family life. See, what I could say is that what I'm after in the big picture is getting to Boston. So what I'm after this week is to run 5 miles and feel springy. And we should be able to be that specific in terms of our spiritual goals. What I'm after is Christ-likeness. So what I'm working on right now is the mind of Christ in terms of sexual lust, or the mind of Christ in terms of an attitude of servanthood, or the actions of Christ in terms of love for strangers, or compassion to the poor, or whatever. If we can be that specific, well, then we can hope to attain our big goals by month and year by year working on short-term attainable aspects of it. As in all things, so as in this area, you can't replace accountability. There's no replacement for being accountable to someone who's got the same goals. And so I'd encourage you to explore the possibilities in this church and perhaps in other places for you instead of establishing relationships of accountability with people who have the same goals, or at least people you can be completely honest with, and say, this month I'm working on cleaning up my thought life. Now you have to be careful who you say that to. So you find a brother or sister in Christ who would understand, who could relate. And he says, okay, I'll pray for you. And at least once a week I'll get together with you and talk to you specifically about how you've done on the things you're seeking to do. This month I want to develop a real compassion for the poor. So every day I'm going to take a trip down to the food bank and I'm going to deliver some food and whatever. You know. So you come down with things, and then every week your partner phones you up and says, how'd you do? And you have to embarrass yourself and say, I didn't do anything about it this week. And he'll say, well, why didn't you start? And the embarrassment gets you going. Accountability is a very, very helpful thing. I think an irreplaceable thing. And I would encourage you then to break down your long-term into short-term attainable goals and to be accountable to someone. There's another reason why he says to us who are running with endurance the race that's set before us to fix our eyes on Jesus. When you're training for the race, in the parts of the Christian life that are analogous to training, it's important to set goals. In the parts of the Christian life that are analogous to running the race, it's very important that you focus on the finish line. I found this out in my experience. That first race, I ended up walking for about half an hour, which did disastrous things to my time. But I'd forgotten why I was there, and I didn't have any interest in the parts of it I remembered. And I forgot all about the fact that one way or the other, carried in on a wagon, in a first aid truck, or running in my own strength, I would eventually cross the finish line. The second race I did much better. And one of the things I purposed to do was from the turnaround point at the 14-mile mark, home again, I kept fixed in my mind at all times the finish line. For several years I had on my wall this photograph. I don't know if you can see it from a distance. I don't suppose you want to see it, but this is me and my wife at the end of my second race. Can you see that? I'm the one on the right. And I just finished the race, and I did really well. The second race was everything the first race wasn't, and it encouraged me to run a couple more. And Debbie's father took this picture of us, and she's been standing in the rain for 3 hours and 10 minutes waiting for me, and I've been running in the rain and under people's hoses, getting all wet. So we both look like a couple of drowned rats. But there's big smiles on our faces, and the smiles are indicative of the fact that the goal I strove to meet for 6 months, I attained with 10 seconds to spare. And it was a wonderful day for us. And it helped me in my training for my third race and my fourth race and the fifth race that I've tried twice to get in shape for and have failed. It helped me to recognize that, again, every time I cross a starting line, I'll eventually cross a finish line. And at that finish line will be my wife, who has watched me stumble out the door at 5 o'clock every morning for 6 months and has seen how much time and energy and sweat I've put into this thing. And I know how important it would be to her, I remember this each time, how important it was for her that I finished well and not embarrass myself, and her and the family name. So that helped me keep running. I mean, you know, if you're going to do it, you might as well do it right? It's very embarrassing to invite your friends to watch your husband run a race, and then he straggles in or gets carried across the line by a couple of fat ladies who took pity on him and carried him across as they ran along, something like that. This picture reminded me, by the smiles on our faces, that whatever it takes to cross the real finish line, whatever it takes to get to glory, it's going to be worth it in the end to have put the effort into it. So it not only helped me and motivated me in running the race, but it helped me in thinking about the real race, the race mentioned here in Hebrews chapter 12, to realize that two things will be true of all of us when we cross the finish line, when God calls us home and we stand with Him. One thing is that we'll see that all the effort, whatever the effort was, all the effort was worth it. We'll see when we cross the finish line that it was all worth it. And the second thing we'll all be agreed on is that we're all going to wish we tried harder while we had the opportunity to run the race. I mean, I'm sure every one of us will be in that position. We'll say, it was really worth it to have run this race. I'm glad I ran it, but I wish I'd tried harder. How do you focus on the finish line? Well, I focus on the finish line not by thinking of a small piece of crepe paper that was broken by the winning runner about an hour before I ever got there, but I focused on my wife's face because I realized she was there. She was my reason for finishing. She was there. It's terribly sentimental, but I said it. What do we do then to focus on the finish line? Well, we don't think about our death or about the dramatic conclusion of the world's history, but we think about Jesus, who will greet us at the finish line. For to close our eyes in death is to open our eyes and see Jesus face to face. And if we can fix our eyes on Him, who ran the race before us, who knows everything about what it takes for a human being to run the race of obedience to God, it will motivate us step by step, day by day, to keep on running. It will help us remember what will be painfully, perhaps, clear to us on the last day, that we'll wish we had run harder. And every day I sense, as I focus on Jesus, I should say it this way, every day that I fix my eyes on Jesus, I draw strength from the fact that I know I'll wish I'd run harder, that I know it's worth it to run the race that's set before me as well as I can. Now, when you run a marathon, especially after your first one, you've got a real sense for how long 26 miles is. You know exactly how far you've got to go. There's all kinds of people who are only too glad to mention it to you. Thousands of people line the streets. They're all looking for their one relative, but they cheer you on in compassion. And they say, just 16 miles to go. You can do it, buddy. And then, just 15.9 miles to go. And they name it out to you. So you always know where the finish line is and how far you've got to go and how impossible it may be to get there. The thing about running this race that's set before us is it's a race of unknown length. We don't know but that this might be the last week of the race. I mean, no one knows how long he's got. It's a foolish thing, the Bible says. It's foolish to assume you've got anything more than today. Don't boast about tomorrow, the Bible says, because you don't know what a day may bring forth. This may be our last day. This may be our last week. It certainly may be the last year for some of us. Well, if you knew it was the last mile of the race, you'd pick up the pace and realize the end is near, and you'd finish in high style. It's wonderful to see what happens as runners cross go around the last corner and come into sight of the thousands of people at the finish line. And those who've been dragging the heels, I know because I'm one of them, suddenly pick up their faces and run like they've been doing it all along. In fact, they haven't been. And the sight of the finish line is a remarkable source of vigor and new energy. Well, if we kept our eyes on Jesus, who's at our finish line, and focused our attention on the fact that this may be the last mile of the race, we'll find encouragement and strength to keep on running and to run well, to finish well, because this may be the finish anyway. So we ask ourselves, what if this is my last week? What if this is the last Monday? Well, Monday's a holiday. What if this is the last work week that God asks me to put in before He takes me home? I wish I had done better when I finish, so why don't I do better than I would normally while I'm at it? we fix our eyes on Jesus, which means we set goals and we focus on the finish line and we run with endurance the race that's set before us. There's a lot more in the verses, but I'm running out of time. I just want to tell you that in terms of winning a marathon, something I have no expectation of any personal experience about, what they say is, what they say about winning a marathon is what they say about winning a gold medal in the Olympics. If you want to win a gold medal in the Olympics, you can't choose your parents too carefully. The most important decision you make is who your mother and father will be, because so much of your success in a marathon or your success in an Olympic competition is genetic. It's just what you've inherited, how much physical potential you've inherited. So you got to pick your parents carefully, which is you realize what they're saying. You can't. So a lot of it just has to do with potential. Well, that's because the formula for success in an athletic event is this. Success is potential plus discipline plus desire. You've got to be given so much potential, or there's no sense in thinking of winning. Then you've got to be disciplined and you've got to have some desire. Well, what's our potential as runners in the Christian race? Peter says everything pertaining to life and godliness has been given to us by his great and magnificent promises. Potential's no problem. You all have, if you are in Christ, you have the potential to run a really good race. So then, potential's not an issue. What about discipline? That's not an issue either. The Holy Spirit is not a spirit of timidity, but a spirit of power and love and discipline. We all have as much discipline as we want. Potential's not an issue. Discipline's not an issue. So it all comes down to desire. And the simple question to consider as you think about running the race that is set before us has to do with desire. It's simply this. How much do you want to run well? How much of a desire is it that you succeed in running with endurance the race that's set before us? We could ask, too, how much will you want to have run well as you stand at the finish line, face to face with Jesus? There is nothing that this world offers worth more than a look of pleasure on his face as he says to us, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant," or "Well run, thou good and faithful runner." Nothing in this world can hold a candle to pleasing Christ with the sum total of our lives. So, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. Fixing our eyes on Jesus and setting short-term attainable goals, let us all run with endurance the race that is set before us. Let's pray.